Well, good evening. I'm Graham Barrett, Vice President of the Institute here in Victoria. Welcome. We're here this evening because Australia is at war in a faraway country of which we know enough to make us quite nervous. This evening's event will be dedicated to trying to clarify many of the issues surrounding our involvement there. Don't forget we have some 1,550 troops in Afghanistan. We see across the Western world, those countries that are involved in Afghanistan, falling public support. As the fallen soldiers come home, we can see people questioning what's going on there, questioning why we're in Afghanistan after all these years, with not necessarily very much to show for it. We see a government in Kabul, which to many people is corrupt and incompetent. We see that President Obama has announced that he wants to phase in a pullback at the middle of next year, and we're looking at the possibility of some kind of withdrawal at some stage. This all may change as circumstances develop, but already it's believed that the Taliban is sensing victory, and all they have to do is to keep fighting as much as they want to, and then wait for the withdrawal, and then move back in and take over and reinstate that ghastly regime that we saw a few years ago. So big questions revolve: why are we there? Are we there to support our alliance with the United States? Are we there in the front line against Islamist extremism? Are we there to build up the government and secure the society, or all of these things and many more? I'm very pleased to welcome this evening two distinguished speakers. Major General retired Jim Molan will speak first. He's a career soldier who's served in many fields, not least of them in Iraq, in a very major position there. Paul Barrett, of course, is a former Secretary of the Department of Defense and keenly equipped to discuss what it's like to field our troops in a combat zone as tricky as this one. So, General Molan, may I ask you to begin the proceedings?
Graham, thank you very much for the invitation. It's pointless to commence this debate without setting the conditions and at least trying to get rid of a range of marginal issues that will derail us if we don't address them initially. I'll talk about winning. Winning at the coalition level, winning at the Australian level, winning at the country level, and winning at the Uruzgan province level. To me, in this conflict, there is only one thing that's more important than winning, and that is to define what you mean by winning. Before I start in the substance of my argument, though, I'll deal with one of the greatest straw men that are regularly erected and then heroically dismantled by various commentators. There is no military-only solution to the war in Afghanistan. And guess what? I have never heard a soldier ever say that there was. Everyone knows who knows anything about the subject, that the only solution is a comprehensive military-civilian solution applied cleverly with enough resources over an applicable period of time. There are very few certainties in wars. What we deal with is mainly probabilities. You can have a great plan with great resources and still lose, and you can have a dumb plan with few resources and be very, very lucky and win. The question that a society needs to address is how much of its strategy is it going to base on luck, and how much risk can it tolerate. Strategy in these types of wars requires a process of increasing the probability of winning and decreasing the probability of losing, and then working long and hard on the implementation. How you increase the probabilities is to have a good plan, good leadership, sufficient resources, and adequate time to apply them. That rarely happens. Not because it can't happen, but because governments decide to go to war and then consistently under-resource the war. Simplistic statements are invariably wrong. In sound bites, I might say that the war is winnable. What I really mean is that if you have a good plan, based on a good strategy, good leadership and adequate resources applied cleverly over time, then you have a fair chance of winning. That's as good as it ever gets. So really, in the next few minutes, there is very little that I can prove to you about how a war can be won, which is why inspired and competent political and military leadership that creates trust in an environment of honour is so important at each level, from the politician through the generals and, most importantly, down to the soldiers. And that kind of environment must be understood by the voters. I like to think of conflict at three levels: strategic, operational and tactical. Applied to Afghanistan, it goes something like this. The tactical level of deployed civilian and military on the ground in Afghanistan, at least for those members of the coalition who are trying to win, is probably okay. They will do their job, they're smart, they will innovate and they will adapt. We at the higher level should offer guidance and then get out of their way. If there are enough of them, and if they have the time to have an effect, they will have a fair chance of being successful. That's the tactical level. The operational level, where generals make a campaign plan, is not bad. The plans are now based on years of experience, and the UK and the US generals running the war are as smart as they get, and they've got bunches of experience. They've got more resources now, but the issue of time is very, very confused. The problem invariably lies at the strategic political level, where insufficient resources have been applied to Afghanistan for the last 8 or 9 years, and now a more constricted time limit has been applied to the increased resources that have been allocated to Afghanistan at the last minute. Governments need to learn strategy, and so far the operational success of the military has been far more impressive than the ability of politicians at the strategic level. Now, I'm not questioning our troops or their actions at the tactical level. I stand in absolute admiration of them. I am questioning governments and their resolve, particularly the difference between rhetoric and action, and whether this serves Australia's and the West's long-term strategic interests. I define military strategic success for Australia in Uruzgan province as being to make a commitment that effectively supports the Obama war plans, and so not only benefits the maximum number of Afghan people in Uruzgan province, but derives strategic and security benefits for Australia over the long term. Australia's military responsibility is to win in Uruzgan so that we can assist the campaign across all of Afghanistan to win. I refute the view that Australia can make no difference in Afghanistan. Where our soldiers are, they make a difference. Our allies need us, and the people of Uruzgan province need us. The question is, do we have enough military and civilian resources to be successful where we need to be? I also reject the view that Australia cannot do more. The fact is that the government has elected not to do more. It's demonstrable that we could do more. Talk of the need to withhold troops for imagined regional commitments, only few of which are valid, is very, very convenient indeed. Finally, before I answer the specific question, let me say that you can be both deeply regretful of the death and injury and sacrifice of our deployed soldiers and civilians and still be an advocate of a more effective strategy that may tragically result in greater death, injury and sacrifice. There are still things in this world that are worth dying for. Many of our national leaders understand this, and our soldiers understand this. That's their unlimited liability. So, Afghanistan, can it be won? And if so, how? It goes back to three questions, really. Why you are there, what resources you allocate, and how you conduct the campaign. The trick is to align the why, the what, and the how. A very common quote from an authority on militaries in Western societies is that the ultimate purpose of soldiers is the achievement of political ends designated by statesmen. This is a key part of our society and our political system, and I deeply believe in it and know that it's probably the best in human history. Unfortunately, we are all human, and it's not just the high politics of foreign policy that soldiers are to achieve at a cost to life, limb and treasure, but sometimes low domestic politics. Sometimes the ends designated by statesmen are ambiguous, contradictory and uncertain, but it was ever thus. But if you cannot get the why right, you have a most serious problem to start with. And the traditional way of looking at the why is that we're in Afghanistan for humanitarian reasons, for alliance reasons, for counter-terrorist and stability reasons, and regional stability reasons, and lastly, because we are there and it's harder to withdraw once you're already there than it is to not go in the first instance. But in my view, these are far too clinical. There is a higher why, if you ask me, that permeates the more clinical reasons for being in Afghanistan. I don't believe that you can separate what Australia does in Afghanistan from the fact that Australia, for all its perceived and real faults, is a paragon of post-Enlightenment achievement for mankind. Australia has much to offer the world. I don't believe that you can separate what Australia does in the world from the concept of honour. The honour of a nation, the honour of a military, the honour of a government. It's honour that really keeps mates, even international allies, together, not some cynical me first and only approach. I don't believe that you can separate what Australia does in Afghanistan from the needs that are out there in the world, the needs of the Afghans and the Pakistanis, the needs of our allies and the needs of Australian people for security, stability and protection from terrorism and the maintenance of the international system. Australia has certain responsibilities. I believe that a foreign policy based on elitist cynicism is wrong. Self-interest and reality, of course, but a cynical exploitation of the efforts of others is fundamentally wrong. To commit to a war and to say that we support President Obama's campaign plan in Afghanistan, yet do far, far less, is a betrayal of those we should be helping, the ideals of the people of Australia, and is low domestic politics, the kind that Elliot Cohen spoke about earlier. So I think that we should be in Afghanistan for humanitarian reasons, for alliance reasons, and for self-interest reasons. And much of this is fed by an understanding that Australia has much to offer, it has certain responsibilities, it's an honourable nation that only asks its people to do honourable things in a legal and ethical way. If you get the why, the what is pretty easy: sufficient civilian, military and financial resources to match your objectives and sufficient time to have an effect across a war or in your small part of the war. The how, again, is not rocket science. Campaign plan and leadership to set the conditions to win, letting those at the coalface determine the tactics. The biggest decision that a government must make is to have a strategy either to win or just to be involved. If you're going to go to a war and the most important thing on your mind is to come home, the traditional end state, then I suggest that you cut out the middleman and stay at home. If the most important thing on your mind in going to war is that no one gets hurt, then the best way of doing that is to keep your soldiers in the barracks. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a deep philosophical and strategic lesson for all of us in the American TV show known as Married with Children, where the promiscuous but easily confused teenage daughter called Kelly, going out on a date, says repeatedly to remind herself as she walks out the door, dinner first, then sex. Dinner first, then sex. The strategic lesson, ladies and gentlemen, for all of us is win first, then come home. Win first, then come home. The way that President Obama expresses his campaign plan is really to disrupt, dismantle and defeat, sometimes he says destroy. The way that the tactics are expressed are shape, clear, hold, build and transition. In Uruzgan province, I believe that the coalition forces can do little more than disrupt. Let's focus down quickly and have a look at Uruzgan province. I've heard population estimates that go from 300,000 to 600,000. Let's say it's got a population of 500,000 people. History says you probably need 10,000 efficient soldiers to conduct a counterinsurgency in that population level. I reckon you could probably do it for about 6,000 to support the Obama campaign. We currently have a bit over 3,000. Therefore, we're 3,000 short by the best way of looking at it. The Dutch are about to take half of that away. Therefore, we're 4,500 people short of a 6,000 total. Will the US come in with troops as well as with leadership? The minister, who, God bless him, left today, and a fine man that he was, the minister seemed reluctant to tell us that in his recent statements whether the Americans would in fact not only lead us in the province, what an insult to our sovereignty, would not only lead us in the province, but he failed to say whether in fact they would bring in enough troops. You can have the greatest leadership in the world, but if you've got 1,500 troops and you need 6,000 at least, you're kidding yourself. Our current deployments, I believe that there are a number of things we should do, and that would take our total of troops deployed in that province up to about up by an additional 1,700 to 2,000. People say we can't do that, that's too many. If that's the case, I'd like to trade test every one of the 80,000 people, regular, full-time and part-time in the Australian Defence Force, and find out exactly what they're doing. In 2006, our maximum deployments were 5,200 soldiers. Therefore, there are a lot of soldiers out there that we could still deploy. If Australia leads seriously in a Rusgan, there is some chance of others joining us, and there is a greater chance of achieving our declared war aims with some integrity and with some honour. If an argument is put that we can't do it because we're too busy, we should look at the numbers in the Australian Defence Force. There are, as I said, 80,000 there. We have short tour lengths and, with the exception of our Special Forces, longer breaks between tours. It may be difficult for Australia to do because the ADF is essentially a two-speed military. Most of the ADF are happily and comfortably at peace. A very, very few are at war. And even if it's true that we can provide an increased commitment only for a limited period of time, which I doubt, except for the issue of resolve, and we can only do it for, say, 1 or 2 rotations, then now is the time to do the 1 or 2 rotations, when our allies need us most. This is the most critical time in Afghanistan. How palatable might it be politically? Assessing this really is the realm of the government and the government in waiting. All I can do is really guess. But my observation is that simplistic questions in facile polls will always deliver 80% objection to military commitments. You ask me, should we bring our troops home from Afghanistan? And I will answer yes. Such polls may not be the best base for policy, as Kevin Rudd may have found out. There is a time for high principle, for honour and for government leadership, which has been conspicuous in its absence from our deployment to Iraq and to Afghanistan above the deployed soldier level. If a government acts honourably on principle and is prepared to lead, and its military commitment is sufficient to achieve some level of success, history has shown that voters respond dramatically to successful military operations. There may come a time when we dump Afghanistan and prepare to confront whatever follows Afghanistan in perhaps Pakistan, Somalia, in the Maghreb, even perhaps in Islamic parts of Southeast Asia. I don't know. But we should not concede defeat until we have tried to win. The war in Afghanistan may have been going for 8 years. The current surge in troops is not yet completed. There are only roughly 21,000 of the 30,000 troops in country, but the fight is only about to start. It's my judgment that this war is winnable. The coalition has a good plan based on a good strategy, good leadership, and the level of resources will soon be better than ever and approaching adequacy. If applied cleverly over an appropriate time, then the coalition has a fair chance of winning. Australian society should and could play a more significant part in this conflict, and governments should lead. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I now welcome Paul Barrett.
Thanks very much, Graham. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming out to hear us tonight. I'm going to disappoint most of you, I think, by saying that I basically agree with most of what Jim has to say. So this is meant to be a debate, but I think we will have a debate because I intend to approach the problem in a different way and try to take, first of all, a conceptual approach drawn from social science and then zero in on the application of that approach to the Afghanistan problem. So if you'll bear with a physical scientist attempting to be a social scientist, I'm going to propose to you that Afghanistan is a wicked problem. And there's a very substantial literature about wicked problems from the 1960s onwards. And they have about 7 or 8 principal characteristics. The first is that they're difficult to define clearly. Different stakeholders have different versions of what the problem is. And there's usually an element of truth in all of those versions. Secondly, they have many interdependencies and are often multi-causal, and there are conflicting goals and objectives within the broader policy problem. And this means that solving them requires coordinating interrelated responses and accepting trade-offs between the conflicting goals. Attempts to address wicked problems often lead to unforeseen consequences, and this arises from the complex connections between the component elements of the problem. Often they're not stable. The nature of the problem is changing while the attempt is being made to fashion and implement a solution. I think we can see some resonances with that phenomenon in Afghanistan. They're socially complex, and it's their social complexity that often overwhelms the efforts to solve them. They hardly ever sit conveniently within the responsibilities of one organisation. The solution to wicked problems usually involves changing the behaviour of some or all of the stakeholders. Some wicked problems are characterised by chronic policy failure. They have 2 very important key characteristics. One is they have no stopping rule. That is, there's no mechanism for deciding whether to stop or continue a process on the basis of present and past events. So there's no clear defined point at which you say there's no point in continuing in Afghanistan or in any operation of that kind, whereas there are many things in life where you can say, well, the game's not worth the candle, we stop now. The second thing is every attempt to solve a wicked problem is a one-shot operation because there's no opportunity to learn by trial and error. Every attempt is significant. You can't turn the clock back and say, well, that didn't work, we've stuffed up, we'll have our time back and try a different approach. You have to live with what you've done. Then, of course, there's a higher level of wicked problems called super wicked problems. The first characteristic of those is that time is running out. Second one is there's no central authority. And the third one is that those seeking to solve the problem are also causing it. Now let's have a look at elements of the wicked problem in Afghanistan. And Jim's adverted to quite a few of these. The first is there's no clear definition of victory, of what success would look like. And this is a critical impediment to achieving anything that looks like success, because if we don't know what success is, how do we plan for it? How do we commit appropriate resources to it? We have to know what we want to do there. The problem is that the stakeholders are so diverse that the more we try to define success, the more likely we are to create division in the stakeholder group. If we try and have a very clear definition of what we're doing there, you run the risk the Germans say, but that's not why we're here, or the Dutch will say, that's not why we're here. So you've got a problem. I think the objectives are deliberately fuzzy because you wouldn't get everybody to sign up if you tried to define them more clearly. Second element of the wicked problem, or second exemplar of the wicked problem, whatever our objectives are, we need to be there to achieve them. But the foreign presence in the country is an important part of the problem. There are many insurgents who are not fighting us out of religious or ideological antipathy, and they're certainly not fighting us because they want to take over some part of the world outside Afghanistan. They're fighting us because we're in their country, their valley or their village. There's a very important subset of that. An aspect of our presence in country raises a really wicked problem for all ISAF contributors. That is that ISAF forces will inevitably find themselves in tight spots from which they can be extricated by the use of overwhelming force. The use of overwhelming force to secure that tactical objective poses a high risk of civilian casualties. You call in the drones and you blow a few buildings away, and you destroy an ambushing force or something like that, and you have a high risk of civilian casualties, and civilian casualties are inimical to our strategic objectives. So we've got really tough choices to make about how much are we prepared to protect our own forces at the cost of our strategic objective, or allow our own forces to be at risk to preserve the strategic objective, and that's a very difficult one to sell domestically. Aspect 3, the problem needs an Afghan solution for which central, provincial and local government are critical. So we cannot continue to bypass the central government in aid delivery, as has been happening from 2002. I read a figure a couple of years ago, something like 85% of all aid projects in Afghanistan were started without reference to any level of Afghan government. We just come in and say, we're going to build a school here or some facility there, and it doesn't have an Afghan government brand name on it. As far as the local people are concerned, they get nothing out of the Afghan government because it's just these foreigners running around doing aid projects. But on the other hand, the Afghan government, that phrase comes from an article in The Economist a few months ago. The Afghan government is weak, corrupt and predatory. So if we strengthen the Afghan government or do more to respect its prerogatives, do we strengthen the government or do we strengthen the corruption and predation? 4, everyone wants to meddle in Afghanistan. There's no hope of a sustainable solution in the face of a continuing external intervention. Just go back to my first point, that there's a picture in the public mind that Afghanistan is a very remote and faraway place. Afghanistan's historical problem is it's not a remote and faraway place, it's a crossroads in the centre of Central Asia, and everyone wants to intervene there. The whole history of the great game in the 19th century was the Brits and the Russians wanted to make sure they were in control of that strategically important space. The problem here is that there's insufficient trust between the nation-state stakeholders for any of them to refrain from intervening. And I refer in particular to India and Pakistan. I mean, each of them thinks that we've got to be in control there, and Pakistan has pretensions to be the dominant state in Central Asia. So if we're running Afghanistan and our good mate Gulbuddin Hekmatyar is in charge, then we'll be in control also of Tajikistan, Uzbekistan and what have you. Now, there are 3 approaches to solving wicked problems. The first is authoritative, and that's where you reduce the complexity by placing the responsibility in the hands of a very few people. The second is competitive. You basically leave the opposing ideas to battle it out, and the competitors themselves are responsible for putting forward their preferred solution. The third is collaborative, and you engage all stakeholders to find the best solution for all. Now, an example of the authoritative approach might be World War II, where the Allies have said, we're not going to have Hitler at the table. When we're wanting to solve the post-war solution, we're simply not going to have Hitler or his successors at the table. We demand unconditional surrender, we'll make the rules. That's not a prospect in the Afghanistan case. There's no central authority sitting above the whole problem. There's a possibility that the UN could play that role in certain very narrow circumstances. There's no one to select a smaller group of stakeholders. That could change if a negotiated outcome were in prospect. I mean, when you get exhaustion, you can end up saying, as say we did at the end of the Vietnam War, where you basically narrow it down to 3 or 4 negotiators who just thrash out the deal, and the rest of us just take whatever emerges. So that could change, and I think that those 3 types of approaches are not completely mutually exclusive. They shade into one another at the boundaries, but they're a good way of thinking about solutions. But it's not likely that you will get the authoritative approach while either side thinks it's winning. Second is a competitive solution. That's in effect where we're locked into now. The different ideas are backed by the force of arms and organised violence, and they're often that's financed by the drug trade or covert assistance from foreign governments pursuing their own agenda. The third is the collaborative solution. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Mike Mullen told Congress on September 2008, we cannot kill our way to victory. I agree with that, and obviously Jim agrees with that. What's needed is better Afghan governance, more foreign investment, a viable alternative to poppy farming. This is Mullen to Congress, not my words. Greater cooperation with Pakistan, more US non-military assistance, and that looks to me like the start of a collaborative approach. But a clear choice has to be made. In a competitive solution, the focus will be on attacking the opposing forces. In a collaborative solution, the focus will be on protecting the population and providing security to the development effort. Winning over the non-hardcore Taliban, and in that sort of approach, it's critical to avoid collateral damage. And what that means is you can't have a collaborative solution with a little bit of killing our way to victory thrown in. Have to make a very clear choice. Australia's dilemmas in all of this are, first of all, alliance management. The alliance is important, and walking away from something we've undertaken to do is not a trivial matter. But we can't write blank cheques. The alliance doesn't commit us to participate in wars we don't believe in, and we can't be expected to continue to support wars which we do not think are being prosecuted in a manner conducive to success. So we have to always think, is what we're being asked to do reasonable? Is it likely to produce a result we can live with in a way we can live with? The tail can't wag the dog. We can't determine how the war is going to be fought. We're a very minor ally of a very great power, so we can't really determine how the war is going to be fought. Second dilemma is it's ethically difficult to walk away from a mess we helped to create. The experience of Timor in 1942, Algeria and Vietnam makes that unconscionable. I mean, it's all very fine for us to say, oh, look, you know, we can't go on with this, we're off, you know, we wish you all the best. And it's worth casting our mind back to 1942. When we left Timor, we left the Timorese villagers who'd supported us and the Portuguese missionaries who supported us to the tender mercies of the Japanese, and the Japanese certainly were not in a very forgiving mood. So that the consequences for the people who'd supported us were very dire. The same happened when de Gaulle decided to get out of Algeria, and Vietnam wasn't great either. It's a very bleak outlook for the people who've supported us in good faith. And the sense that we're not there for the long haul forces people to hedge their bets. So some of Karzai's hedging his bets at the moment, I think, is born of the fact that he's not sure how long we're going to be around. So what's the best option? I mean, I've wrestled with this, and I'd really prefer to duck this question, but as I'm standing up here in public, I think I have to submit myself to the discipline of trying to say, what should we be trying to do? I think the best option is a rigorous adoption of a collaborative approach, and that means an absolute commitment to the security of the population and the development effort. To me, pursuing that approach would make Northern Ireland or Cambodia the more appropriate model. Everybody's talking about Vietnam as the example, but what we did in Cambodia was marginalise the irreconcilables, welcome the less hardcore back. Under this model, we would welcome the less hardcore back into the mainstream of Afghan life. This will take a long time, and the option only exists if we're prepared to commit to it for the required time. Just a couple of concluding thoughts. We must deal with Afghanistan as it is. That means we need to get a clear picture of what it is. It's a very poor country with low levels of literacy. It's got weak institutions, great ethnic complexity, more than 30 languages spoken, complex system of micro-societies, very harsh terrain and climate, limited infrastructure. All that's a given. That's what we've involved ourselves in. It is not a country without a history. Some of the press commentary would have you believe this is just a bunch of wild tribesmen living in some sort of desertified country, and that's the way it always has been. It's ungovernable. It's the way it always will be. If anything, Afghanistan's had too much history over the last 30 years, not in insufficient amount. For a start, it's got the cultural legacies of the Persian and Mughal empires. The territory of Afghanistan today was carved out of those two declining empires in 1747, and a strong ruler managed to create a state out of it. In the 1920s to 1970s, it was one of the most peaceful countries in Asia. People of my generation used to hitchhike around the place, and there were the famous double-decker bus trips from Kathmandu to London. It was a place people liked going to. There have been indigenous modernisation efforts from the 1920s, attempts to establish a national army as a unifying force, expansion of education with a secular curriculum, education of girls under royal patronage, the King and the Queen at separate schools, delivering lessons to show that this is what the future looks like. Freedom of choice in marriage for women and inheritance rights, limited unveiling, a requirement to wear Western dress at court and in certain parts of the city. You could not enter certain parts of the city unless you were dressed in Western dress. Kabul University dates from the 1930s. Nangarhar established in Jalalabad in 1962, which means from the royal period as well. And then Herat 88, Kandahar 99, and a succession of universities being established now under American aid programs. Are there grounds for hope? What can we build on? There is a sense of Afghan national identity. The minorities are not seeking to break away, they want a better Afghanistan. With very low levels of technology, it supports a population of 30 million in an area smaller than New South Wales. So it's not a desert. There's a lot of arid country, but there's fertile river valleys as well. There's significant urbanisation. We always equate urbanisation with civilisation. Kabul's a city of 2.5 million people. There are 3 more cities the size of Canberra, a couple more over 100,000 people and several more over 50,000 people. There are significant urban centres as well as tribal regions. So what's the desired end state? I would suggest it's an Afghanistan left in peace to create for itself that better Afghanistan that the overwhelming majority of its population seeks, a solution designed by Afghans for Afghans, but this time round with the requisite financial, technical and developmental support. The Afghan state has been seeking help from the West since the 1920s, and we have always said either you're too small and too insignificant for us to bother with, or in the 1920s the Brits said we're really responsible for your foreign affairs, nobody else deal except through the Foreign Office. And in the 1950s, 40s and 50s, Americans said, unless you're prepared to sign up for the Cold War with that great big Soviet neighbour of yours, we're not interested in you. So we missed a couple of opportunities. This time around we've actually got to provide the support. The key questions are, do the participating nations have the political will and the political patience to achieve their desired end state, and are the ISAF forces equipped for counterinsurgency and nation building? Thank you very much for your attention.